Well, I tell you what we're going to try and do today. Give you a little bit of the history behind this. About 16 years ago, I was a young student at the University of Kentucky in the graduate school in the history department. And I was working on a master's in history, and being in graduate school is not that dissimilar from being in the federal penitentiary. You got to break out, you got to figure out how to get through and get out, and I needed a project. And I happened to stumble onto a group of records that was in the Frankfurt Housing Authority's. It was in the basement of one of the public housing units that was run by the Frankfurt Housing Authority, and it was the records of the North Frankfurt Slum Clearance Project, which is a project. You all remember Farnham Dudgeon? Yep. Farnham, when he was running he was, I think, the president of the Chamber of Commerce back in the mid-50s, had initiated this effort to clean up the bottom and the Craw and to make it into this really pristine kind of place. And that was a project that was supposed to last about 4 or 5 years and cost $2 million. And at the end of the project, all of the substandard housing, and there was over like 323 buildings down in the bottom, all of that was supposed to be cleaned out, and there would be all of this new single-family and multifamily housing that would be built back, and the residents could buy back into their old neighborhood. And for a lot of reasons, what happened was the project, instead of taking 4 or 5 years, lasted roughly from 1955 to 1972, which the dedication of the Capitol Plaza Tower. A project that was supposed to cost roughly $2 million cost $49 million. And the only housing that was built back in there was the Riverview Public Housing, which is just beyond the Capitol Plaza Tower. I don't think anybody lives in there anymore. Excuse me. But there wasn't any other single-family or multifamily housing built back there. What went back in there, which, as you all know, the Capitol Plaza Tower, which was built by the Breathitt administration, the YMCA at the corner of Wilkinson and Broadway, the John C. Watts Federal Building, the Fountain Place Plaza Shops. So what went back instead of residential housing was this governmental civic complex. What was lost in there is what we want to talk about today. What existed before what's there now is what we want to focus on. I have got a slide projector, which you really ought to take pictures of this. This is a dinosaur. You won't see many slide projectors. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it will work. It has failed me miserably a couple of times, but if it fails us, I have this higher tech stuff. This is a DVD with a copy for my good friends at Cable 10, the original presentation on the Craw, which was done back in 1992 for historic Frankfurt. So if nothing else, we can default down to whatever room you have that has a TV and a DVD, and we can pop this in there and you all can watch that. This is a much lengthier program than you probably want to watch in one setting. I think it's about an hour and a half. We've got about 30 minutes of slides. And what we're going to do today, we are going to get on board a time machine, and we're going to go back to the year 1958. Who remembers Don Hewlett? Do you remember Don Hewlett? Wasn't he our county court clerk? Don's dad, which I believe is Jack Hewlett, was a real estate man, and Jack, at the start of the North Frankfurt Slum Clearance Project, one of the things the federal government required is you had to go and document the conditions in the neighborhood that was going to be subject to urban renewal. So Jack went down in there in the 50s and he took pictures of everything. And we are going to look at those pictures. So it's as if we froze time in 1958 and we're going to walk the streets of the bottom in 1958 if this dinosaur will cooperate. Okay, now I will get out of the way here, but I'm going to have to, I forgot to bring my little laser pointer thing, so I'll have to come forward. I hope you can hear me. I'm going to try to talk loud enough. This is the Kentucky River. This is Broadway where the railroad tracks run. This is Wilkinson Street. So here's north, here's south, west is the river, and then east is heading over here toward the old state capitol and the old state capitol annex. So when you talk about the bottom, the first question is, where was it? And these little dash marks here are the lines that Jack Hewlett drew in for the urban renewal area. So when I talk about the bottom, I'm talking about an area that's roughly 50 acres in size, that in its heyday probably had somewhere around between 1,500 and 2,000 people living in it, had over 320 separate structures housing 460 dwelling units. And when you look at this, what you're seeing here is a very densely populated residential neighborhood. This picture again, 1958. Here are some of the landmarks. Do you see this L-shaped building? That is the old Mayo Underwood School. Opened in 1929, torn down in about 1965. This is a school for the African Americans in the community and one of the more beloved institutions. Let's see here. This would be Madison Street. Here is Washington Street that runs all the way up. Then you've got, let's see, Crawfish Alley, or not Madison, and then here's Wilkinson. Broadway, Clinton, Miro, and a street that used to be called Blanton Street. And so it's hard to imagine when you go down there now what this was like. But it was a very populated residential and business neighborhood. This is one of the earliest maps of Frankfurt, the 1803 Achilles Sneed map. And Al Farrow could tell you that Frankfurt was founded by General James Wilkinson. And Al helped participate in the bicentennial celebration of Frankfurt back in 1986. But General Wilkinson, his dream of Frankfurt was it was going to be this big commercial center. And so he platted out all of this property, and he was going to sell all of these lots to people who would move into Frankfurt. Again, this is 1803. Here is the old Capitol Square right in the center. And here is what we're calling the bottom or the Craw right behind it. It's all platted out, all ready to sell. And what happens is not many people actually move into it initially. This is an 1854 Hart and Maypother map. The S-curve is the Kentucky River. Here is North Frankfurt, and here is South Frankfurt. So what you learn is that prior to the Civil War, 1860, very few people live in South Frankfurt. All of the action, all of the settlement is in North Frankfurt. North Frankfurt is where it's happening. And this is a little bit closer. This is the same map. Here is the old state capitol. Here's Broadway with the railroad tracks. And I think everybody knows that it used to be that the Kentucky State Penitentiary was right here in Frankfurt, right down from the bottom. And here it is right over here. So here is the bottom. Let's see, that's not very clear to see, is it? There we go. But you can see, even in 1854, that section that we're calling the bottom, which is that upper left-hand quadrant, not many people there prior to the Civil War. 1871, bird's eye map of Frankfurt. Now look at the bottom. Again, here's Broadway, here's the river, and all of this right in here is what we would call the bottom. 1871, just about 17 years later than that earlier map that I just showed you. What has happened that's different between those two times? The Civil War has taken place. And what has happened between the decade of 1860 and 1870 is that the black population of Frankfurt has grown by 82%. Probably over 3,000 African Americans have moved into Frankfurt. These are newly freed slaves, and they're coming into Frankfurt for education. The Freedmen's Bureau is setting up schools. They're coming in for jobs. Frankfurt is industrializing during this period. We're getting all kinds of factories and business establishments that we never had before. tell you an interesting fact. You see this big building here? That is the public square where the old state capitol is. Well, that building is not there. That's a picture of a building that never got built. That is the vision of what the Kentucky State Capitol was going to be. They were going to tear down the old Capitol. Here is the old Capitol Annex. It actually exists. They were going to build another piece of the annex and put this right between the two buildings. It never got built because A, they ran out of money, and B, they determined that the size of the lot wasn't big enough to hold that particular building. So it's interesting, old maps can show you not only what was, but what actually might have been or might never have been. So anyway, after the Civil War, the bottom is really picking up. People are moving in. This is a landing zone. The housing is cheap, and we'll explain why in just a second. There's the bottom again. And this particular map is the 1882 Atlas of Frankfort and Franklin County. And you can see all kinds of things. Here's the old state capitol. There's the old Capitol Annex. Here's Broadway again, and here's the bottom. Anytime you see a green block, that's a public building. This is the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. Have you heard of Corinthian Baptist Church? Corinthian Baptist Church still exists today. It is down on 2nd and Murray on the corner in South Frankfort. But originally, Corinthian Baptist dates its origins back to the 1860s and 70s and right here on Miro Street. It actually might predate the 1860s and 70s, but it was right in the bottom. One of the first gas works in Frankfort was right in the bottom. And you could see all the settlement there that's going on. This is a booming section of Frankfort after the Civil War. And here's one of the reasons. We are one of the processing centers for eastern Kentucky timber. Hardwood logs are being sawn down in eastern Kentucky. They put them down on the river. They wait till the spring floods come, and they raft the timber out of eastern Kentucky. And so all these mountaineers bring their timber down here, and I can't tell you how many sawmills, how many woodworking places, chair factories, all were along the river here in Frankfort. And they bring all of this down here to be processed. So there's tons of jobs in the distillery industry, in the logging industry, in the wood processing industry, and it's all happening here in Frankfort. The other thing that people want to know about the Craw and the bottom, oh, need to get out of the way? Okay, is, well, there's two things. How did it get the name the Craw? Let's talk about that for a second. One school of thought says Craw, C-R-A-W, is a shortened version of crawfish. This was called Crawfish Bottom for this very reason. Up come the floodwaters, down go the waters, and all these crawfish are all over the place in the streets, just cluttering up everything. That's one theory. Another theory is this area was inhabited by some of the toughest, roughest men and women in Frankfort. Men and women so tough they would stick in your craw. That, I don't know. It's a colorful phrase. The other theory I've heard, and there's some evidence of this, at the turn of the century, early 1900s, there was a gentleman down there who referred to himself as the King of Craw, King of Crawfish Bottom. And if you wanted a house or if you needed some help or groceries, this guy was sort of like a ward healer and a fixer and a man of influence with those folks down there. And they'd send you down to the King of Crawfish Bottom. And then eventually that got shortened to the King of Craw, and eventually they just said, well, you go to Craw. You go down to Craw and you see him. So the area was associated with a particular individual's nickname. So that's another thing. The bottom is obviously the bottom because it's one of the lowest sections in Frankfort. This is an image from the 1880s taken off the roof of the old state capitol looking west. There's Bell Point on the other side of the river. And this is probably the signature feature about the bottom. It floods. It is subject to repeated flooding. And over the years, people would have their houses inundated, their possessions destroyed, and they would always come back in and clean up and re-inhabit the dwellings. And I asked some of the people, I interviewed about 24, 25 elderly people who lived down there. This is back in the early 1990s. And what they said to me was, first of all, we couldn't afford to live any other place. This was the cheapest housing in Frankfurt. Second of all, if they were black, they weren't really allowed to live in any other place. There were very few places that blacks could reside. There were a few other communities in South Frankfurt and some out in the county, but this is one of the places that there was a sense of neighborliness. All your friends were there. Your family, extended family often lived there. So they went back. They'd clean up and go back. 1927, we're looking up Washington Street. This is the intersection of Clinton and Washington. And this is a typical shot because when the floodwaters would come up, they would usually come up at the intersection of Washington and Clinton back through the sewers. This is also the heart of the section that I call Craw. Craw, when you say Craw, people think of gambling, joints, prostitution, crime, vice. Craw is really a very small portion of this bigger area called the Bottom. Craw, if you really look at the center of it, is this intersection of Clinton and Washington Street, whereas the Bottom is a 50-acre area that is much broader than Craw. So I don't try to use those two words interchangeably because in my mind I think Craw is very different than the Bottom, and I'll explain that just a little bit later. 1937 flood. This is a souvenir booklet from the flood. The top is Miro Street, where the Capitol Plaza Tower would be looking toward the river. The bottom is the corner of Miro and St. Clair. This is one of those neighborhood groceries that would be on every corner. You can just see the devastation that this whole community was subject to. 1968 aerial photograph. The urban renewal is in full swing. And you can see what's happening. All of this area that we were calling the Bottom, which is roughly St. Clair Street over to Wilkeson and Broadway up to Blanton, much of it is starting to get torn out. This is the Corinthian Baptist Church. Here's the old Mayo Underwood School for colored students. But these blocks used to all have housing, and now it's gone. By the 1960s, much of what was referred to as the Bottom is beginning to disappear under the bulldozers of urban renewal. Here's another 1968 shot. This is the old American Legion building, a gorgeous cut stone building built by blacks in 1908. And it was a center of business and industry. The American Legion used it. On the second floor, they had a dance hall up there. It was also a Masonic center. When it was originally built, there were all these black civic organizations. There was the Knights of Pythias, the Beloved Brothers. There was the Sisters of the Household of Ruth. There was 23 different chapters of 10 different black organizations about the turn of the century to the 1920s. And they were sort of the social safety network before the government got into this in the 1930s. And this was one of their headquarters buildings, one of the buildings they were very proud of. We are going to walk down in the Bottom now, 1958. We're on Broadway, and we're about to go around the corner here. This shot here is the north side of Broadway, about where the John C. Watts building is. This is the intersection of Broadway and Washington Streets. And this white building where you see the milk sign, let me see if I can get out of the way here. That building was owned by Annie Betts. And we're going to turn the corner. And now what you're looking at is the intersection of Washington and Broadway. And there's the Broadway Meat Market and the shoe shop. And as you go up Washington Street, we're walking north toward Clinton. Here's one of the little beer joints. And these places were everywhere. They were ubiquitous. They have all these interesting names like the Sky Blue, the Blue Moon, the Peach Tree, the Tiptoe In and Stagger Out, White City Cafe. You know, you got all these little places. Sometimes the building is owned by landlords who do not reside in the neighborhood, and they rent it out to a white or to a black to run the business. Sometimes it's a black-owned and operated joint. This particular building was owned by Alec Gordon. And Alec, this is 405 Washington Street, and there are a lot of stories about Alec. But these little joints would be called dance and drink dives. And you could go in and get a beer, or you could get into all kinds of mischief, I'm sure, if you were of that mind to do so. Now here's another. This is the Peachtree Inn. George Taylor is the owner of the building, and I think Willard Riddle managed it. But there's an Earl's 92 sign, and the slogan of Earl's 92 is "Get yours here." And I'm sure you could get virtually anything there that you wanted to get at the Peachtree Inn. And we're walking north on Washington Street. There's another one of the little places, Cy Curran's, the George Taylor's Whiskey Store. Here's one of the little cafes, little businesses. And you find there was over 30 little small businesses operating in the bottom at this time. So it's not just residential. There's a lot of little restaurants. There's an auto repair place, shoe places, grocery stores, lots of little corner grocery stores. Now, here's one of George Taylor's buildings. You see this sign right here? The Club 99. The Club 99 is owned by Maggie and Bob Knott, and it is a place for African Americans to come and enjoy themselves. In the 1950s, when you wanted a place to go Saturday night, the place to go was the bottom. All these joints would have their jukeboxes cranked up. You go down there, and particularly if you're African American, you take your guests down there and you go to a restaurant or you go to one of the joints and hang out. And I was talking to one gentleman. He said you could drive up and down the streets and hear the music coming out of a half a dozen different places, and it was an exciting kind of place to be. And then there's George Taylor's little whiskey store right next door to the Club 99. And you could shoot pool down there. It's sort of what I call a neighborhood culture or a street corner culture. You meet your friends on the street corner there, and they're obviously talking, meeting friends, socializing. Now there is the building I was telling you about, the American Legion. The original name of that building is the Oddfellows Building, and it's right at the corner of Clinton and Washington Street. And just to show you, this is a picture from 1917, a few years after it was built, and there's one of the black Masonic groups standing out to the side. Now these gentlemen, this is either the Knights of Pythias or the United Brotherhood, and it was a very prestigious thing to be joining a civic group, and these civic groups had real functions in the community. They would set up widows and orphans funds. They would do fundraisers for community needs. It was a self-help kind of racial self-improvement focus of these organizations. And I love their uniforms, man. I think these are the Knights of Pythias. You remember the story of Damon and Pythias? That's where they get the Knights of Pythias. Here, when you think about the bottom, and everybody talks about the joints and the gambling and all the vice, but there's a lot of churches down in the bottom. And this is the Bethel Temple, mostly African Americans. This is built in 1947. And it actually, one of the ministers was Sister Lizzie. And it was a holiness church. And church was really important to the residents of the bottom. And it was a social center. You could take, your mother would let you take your boyfriend there. You could actually meet a boy at church. And he better go to church or you can't really see him. It's, here's the little Bethel Temple Annex. It's right behind. And we're still moving up on Washington Street. I don't have a picture of the inside of this, but I'll show you another African American church. St. John's African Methodist Episcopal. Has anybody actually gone inside St. John's? You really need to do that sometime. It is at the corner of Lewis and Clinton Street. And what this is the sanctuary, and it's about the mid-1940s. Look at all those beautiful hats there. It's, you don't see that much in church anymore, the ladies with the hats. But if you go in there, what's stamped on the ceiling is a beautiful image of Moses in the bulrushes. And that's stamped tin all along the sides of the sanctuary. It's really gorgeous. And of course, St. John's AME Church is still a functioning church today. Very beautiful on the inside. We're still walking up Washington Street, and this is one of the small businesses. This is the Blythe and Yunt Garage. And Jimmy Yunt was the he was the owner, and they were running this thing. And I was talking to, I believe it was Mr. Yunt's son, I believe, one of the relatives. I shouldn't say son. And you know, you'd be in there working away, and rats and stuff would come in under the walls, and you know, it was a challenging place to do business, I think, at some time. Now, they talk about this area as a slum, you know, and I'll be honest with you. Of the 320 plus buildings, less than half had indoor plumbing. Most of them heated either by wood or coal. There were very few buildings that would have met any kind of modern building code. Most of those buildings, two reasons, were built back in the 19th century, and many of them were owned by absentee landlords who did not live in the buildings that they owned. So there was less incentive to keep them up. This particular fourplex is owned by Mary W. Bryant, and there was a lot of rental property down there. This little building, interesting story, fascinating story. Who knows Derek Graham, our representative? Well, his relatives live down there, and this is the building that's the house of Anne Graham. Anne Graham is one of the most noted seamstresses of her time. If you needed a dress made, a custom design, you went to Anne Graham, and she could sew anything for you. And I forget exactly how that kinship is to Derek, but this is one of his relatives. And look at all the kids. You can sort of date when these pictures were taken, because look at this here. Hula hoops. The boys have hula hoops. Well, the hula hoops is a 1950s kind of a deal, even if we didn't know when they were made. Do you remember when life used to revolve around the front porch? Life revolves now around your backyard, but it used to be the front porch was where you were. And people would walk down the street and they'd stop and talk to you, and you could cool off in the evening and have your friends and sit out on the porch. And I love this shot because it's reflective of a different kind of culture that existed at that time, a sort of a front porch kind of culture. Just another shot of some of the housing down there. We are on Clinton Street now. We're at the intersection of Clinton and Washington, and we're going to head toward the river, the Kentucky River. And one of the businesses that was down there is Floyd Allen's Barbershop. The barbershop is the heart of the community. It's where you go to pick up all the news and to gossip. And so this is Fred Allen's Barbershop here. And this little laundromat is a business that was, actually the building is owned by a gentleman that you guys might know. This is John Buckner. Now, just because you're a domestic or you work for a family, it doesn't mean you don't have prestige in the community. John Buckner works for a very important, powerful Frankfort family, the Berry family. You know, Berry Hill and the mansion and the Berry Distillery. And John is a domestic for the Berries. Well, he acquires enough wealth. He buys 9 parcels of property down in the bottom, and he's one of the larger property owners there in the bottom. He is well thought of and respected in the black community, even though in essence he's just a domestic worker for one of the Frankfort families. So what I'm saying is, it's not only poor people that live in the bottom or have property in the bottom. There is a black middle class. There are ministers, teachers, doctors, and lawyers that live in the bottom. So when you think of the bottom, a lot of people think, well, it's really basically some very poor people. That's correct. But there's these other people down there too. We're turning the corner onto Washington Street, and we're going to walk up here. This is a place that many of you might have heard of. I believe this is the Blue Moon. Now, the Blue Moon is owned by Grace and Harvey Sarvin, and nobody calls Harvey Harvey. Harvey is 20 grand. And if I remember right, 20 grand is a variety of cigarette. And I guess that was Harvey's smoke, was 20 grand. And Harvey ran the downstairs operation and Grace ran the upstairs operation. And so there's a lot going on at the Blue Moon. This is the Tiptoe Inn Cafe, and as I said earlier, the more informal name is Tiptoe Inn and Stagger Out. So the story on this place is supposedly it had a license to operate as a restaurant, and you couldn't have found a spoon or a fork in the place because that wasn't their primary business. It was more the selling of alcohol. But what you find out is these buildings like this one, they are used for the same purpose for many, many, many years, but they might be owned and operated under different names. The Tiptoe Inn or Tiptoe Cafe, it has many businesses that operate in there that predate it. Here's the same building back in the year 1910 when it's operated by a gentleman by the name of Will Hoyt, who runs it as a restaurant / sort of beer garden kind of place, and he's a city policeman. And so, you know, here's this building under different names, different owners, but serving essentially the same function. A little neighborhood grocery store, building's in really rocky shape. This is Tommy Spaulding's grocery, and we're still moving down Clinton Street toward the river. Do you remember a day when you could run a line of credit at the community grocery, and you'd go in week by week, and you'd get what you needed, and you'd put it on a tab? You'd pay a little bit, you get a little more, you keep your tab paid down, and they let you run on credit. That's what this community is all about in the 50s. There's a grocery on almost every other corner. Frog Woods has a grocery, or Bryant's have a grocery. I mean, there's probably maybe a half a dozen to 10 different little community groceries operating at any one time, all servicing the community and allowing people to run on credit. Here's another one of the joints. This is the Sky Blue Inn. And I was talking to a fellow about the Sky Blue, and he said, you know, I was there one night, and there's this poor old fella. He's drunk and on the floor, just passed out on the floor. And the owner come up to me and he said, now, Joe, we got to get this poor man out of here before somebody rolls him and steals all his money. And what that fella didn't know is I sat in the corner and I watched him steal all that man's money and then come to me to drag him out because there wasn't nothing more to take from him. So you could get yourself in trouble if you went down there looking for trouble. And I think when you think of this place as a place of trouble and violence and vice and gambling and all that, a lot of people went down there and they brought their trouble with them, and it just sort of fed on itself. But again, it's an area right around Clinton and Washington Street where most of these places are. It's not throughout the entire community. There's another little community grocery store. And I love this shot. Can anybody see the little fella peeking back out at us? There he is. I want to show you, when you say slum, that doesn't look like a slum to me. There are some buildings in there that are horrible, but you could also find people who tried within their means, whatever modest means they had, to keep their places up and keep them decent. Now we're at the end of the street here, and this is just another piece of rental property. And you can see this is in a little bit better shape than some of the other. We're going to go up Miro Street, and we're starting at the river, the Wilkinson end of Miro. I love this shot because you can see the woman standing there on the front porch. She looks a little hesitant, looks like, what's going on here? Why is my picture being made? To me, this is sort of analogous of the lives that many people led in the bottom. They're anonymous. We don't know who this woman is. They're in the shadows. You don't quite know the stories on them. I'd love to know the stories of all of these people, but so many of them, they're gone now, and their stories are lost. They're in the shadows, so to speak. Mayo Underwood School. Who was Mayo? Who was Underwood? The year 1882, William H. Mayo, a young Cincinnati high school graduate, comes down to Frankfort, Kentucky, and he takes over the Clinton Street School for colored students. That school was wedged in right behind the Kentucky State Penitentiary. It operates from roughly the 1880s up until 1929 when this beautiful new school opens. Well, who is the Underwood? The Underwood is Dr. E.E. Underwood, an incredible, talented physician, author, poet, newspaper publisher, prominent Republican, and so that's where it gets its name, Mayo Underwood School. From 1929 until about the early 1960s, this is the center of black education in North Frankfort. And do you know, and some of you probably do, every other year there is still an alumni reunion here in Frankfort of the graduates of Clinton Street School and the Mayo Underwood School. And they all come back and they share their memories. I mean, that's how important this institution was and still is to those graduates.
How was it funded?
It was funded, and this is very interesting. Here's the Clinton Street School that was behind the penitentiary. The black residents of Frankfort back in the 1870s imposed a tax on themselves to raise the money to help get this school funded. So it's a desperate desire on the part of the African American community to improve the lot of their children and their grandchildren by having better educational facilities. So this school actually burns in the 1920s and is replaced by the Mayo Underwood School.
Where is the Mayo Underwood School located?
It was at the corner of Wilkinson and Miro. It's right where the Capitol Plaza Tower is now. If you turn into that little automotive roundy round they have right at the base of the tower off of Miro, there is a black obelisk. It's a big piece of granite that has been engraved, laser engraved, that tells the story of the Mayo Underwood School, and it was funded and dedicated by the citizens here of Frankfort. And if you're ever down there by the tower, take the time to go and look at that, because it's really very informative and it's a very beautiful sculpture. Okay, I just wanted to show you. Here is the Kentucky Penitentiary. Here is the colored school, and here's a junkyard. And this is some railroad lines. You can see that initially the Clinton Street School for colored students was wedged in behind the penitentiary and adjacent a junkyard, not exactly the prime real estate. So when they went to Mayo Underwood, they really moved up in the world and had a beautiful building. There is William H. Mayo. This is Dr. E.E. Underwood. He is actually the physician for Kentucky State University up until the 1940s. He dies in about the mid to latter part of the 1940s. And Dr. B.T. Holmes, you might remember Helen Holmes, her husband, Dr. B.T. Holmes, is sort of the successor to Dr. E.E. Underwood. I got to interview Helen. She was a fascinating, very wonderful woman. Here is the faculty of Mayo Underwood. This is the principal, Dr. Blanton. And you might remember a woman in our community referred to as Mother Ellis. Mother Ellis was still alive up until about 2000, 2001. And she was the last surviving teacher of the Mayo Underwood School, I believe. Anyway, she was a great person. I wish you all could have met her. But this is about the year 1938, and this is the entire faculty of Mayo Underwood. And here's the school shortly before its destruction in the mid-1960s. Y'all remember Nash Cox and Nell Cox. Nell Cox, wonderful photographer. She went down in the bottom and took a lot of shots in the 1960s. And these are from some images that she had made. Christopher's Grocery. We're on Miro Street, headed west, right across from the school. Here's a house again right across from the school. I believe the Fields family owned this. I could be wrong on that. Look at some of the beautiful architecture. I love the facade of this little business here. You get a real slice of life. There's a lady seated back there. You can just barely see her, and there she's got her laundry out on the line. We're still walking down Miro Street here. Just fascinating to see the houses and the streets. This is one of John Buckner's properties. It's a fourplex right adjacent to the school. You can see it there. The kids out front playing. That's one of the, these shots were not made to capture day-to-day life, but they sure do a great job of doing that. Isn't that a beautiful, all the barge board there that's under the roof line? Again, little single-family shotgun-style houses. Very special place. Sure looks nondescript. It's in its latter days. It's sort of run down. This was the home of the Tiger Inn. Now, the Tiger Inn is the equivalent of Pete's Corner, but the tiger is the mascot of the Mayo Underwood School. And the Tiger Inn was sort of a little lunchroom kind of restaurant place run by a gentleman by the name of Ewan Atkins. And that place was in operation from 1931 to 1968, one of the oldest continuously operated African-American owned businesses in Frankfurt. And there was no cafeteria in Mayo Underwood. So if the kids didn't go home for lunch, they could go down the street if they had sufficient resources, financial resources, and buy lunch there at the Tiger Inn. Now, Pete's Corner is in South Frankfurt, and that's for the Second Street school kids, and it was sort of the equivalent, the hangout for the white kids. There's a shot from the 1940s, and there's all the kids right out in front of Mr. Ewan Atkins' Tiger Inn. I threw this slide in here because there were so many characters down in the bottom. And this gentleman is a World War I veteran whose nickname is Squeezer, Mr. Squeezer Brown. And Squeezer is a musician. He is a sort of a beloved character in the bottom. And he could be found playing his guitar, playing banjo. He enlisted, served in World War I. And then when he got back, he would use his pension, and he would use a portion of that pension to buy children in the community treats. Now, if you behaved yourself and you were courteous, he'd line up all the kids and he'd take them to one of those community grocery stores and he'd get them treats. And people just thought the world of Squeezer Brown. He had a favorite song that he would sing. That, one of the lyrics is, "I don't bother work, and work don't bother me." One of the things about the bottom is how a community cares for its children. And I talked to so many people that I interviewed, and they said, we were really the children of the community. If you did something wrong, it didn't have to be your mama or your daddy to correct you. And by the time you got home, you probably got a whooping by whoever caught you doing something wrong, and then you'd get a whooping when you got home because the news always traveled ahead of you by the time that you got there. This is a couple of gentlemen, and this is again the 1960s in one of the flooded areas on Washington Street. The gentleman on the left is a WW1 veteran, and that's James Graham, I believe, on the right. And I interviewed the gentleman on the right, and he was the guy I asked, well, why did you keep coming back down into an area that flooded? And he would talk about all these stories about the neighborliness and the caring and the love and how everybody looked out for each other. And you might live on a corner, and around the corner was your grandmother or your extended family. And he talks about a closeness that many people hunger for, but they don't experience in these big subdivisions where you don't even know the guys that live next door. You have a community right here at Ashwood Place where people care and love and look out for each other. In many ways, it's sort of like the bottom in the sense of your neighbors. And that's a rare and a special thing that you should cherish. Let's look at what used to be down there. If we had given this talk back in the late 1990s, early 2000, I could say these buildings would still be down there. These buildings are now gone too. I used to give this talk and I said, if you want to find what's left at the bottom, go down here and, well, there's the cave. That's not there. That's where the transportation building is. Do you remember the old Salvation Army building? That building dates back to the latter part of the 19th century. And of course, it's gone too. These are the last ghosts of the bottom. These are buildings that were right in an alleyway that ran alongside the hill. And see, that's sometimes referred to as a camelback shotgun, reminiscent of the housing that used to be down in there. But they're all gone now. There's the old Simon Furniture Shop. This is the corner of St. Clair and Miro, I believe. But there's the Simon Furniture. But it's all, there's nothing really physically left. That was a little building right across from the Capitol Plaza Tower. Another little duplex. Do you realize how little residential housing is left in North Frankfort? There's that one little block on Ann Street, bounded by Clinton and Miro. There's another little block right beside the what used to be the Farnham Dudgeon Civic Center. But there's almost no residential community in what used to be one of the thriving residential communities of Frankfort. There are so many ghosts around us, and we never really think about it. We never really think about it. Well, I really appreciate your all's patience. There is the YMCA. Here's the John C. Watts. These are all the new buildings. Maybe one day they'll be gone, and these will be ghosts. Well, you guys have been really patient. I probably didn't tell you as many spicy stories as you would have liked to have heard. But thank you for your patience. I hope it sparked a few memories.